Hello, this is Janet Morana, Executive Director of Priest for Life. Welcome to our program. Well, today's program, we're going to be delving into a very sensitive but very important topic. We're going to be talking about sexual abuse. And joining me is a really wonderful member of our pastoral team here at Priest for Life. She founded Rachel's Vineyard and is Dr. Theresa Burke, and she is an expert on this topic. But we also have a beautiful program we're going to be talking about of healing sexual abuse. So joining me now, Dr. Theresa Burke, founder of Rachel's Vineyard, and also Grief to Grace. Theresa, welcome to the program.
So good to be here to talk about Grief to Grace. Thank you.
I know. Well, like I just said at the onset, this is a very sensitive topic. I was kind of like cueing people, like if there's young children, listening, you may not want to be listening with young children around, because this is going to be a very powerful show, an eye-opening of a lot of trauma. But how to heal the trauma. So Grief to Grace is a retreat program you created, and I think it really got birthed out of Rachel's Vineyard, right? Because after decades of listening to these women's stories of trauma from abortion, sexual abuse comes up, doesn't it, Theresa?
Yes, Janet, and it's not just for sexual abuse, it's for all forms of abuse, which would be physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse certainly, and neglect is also a form of abuse. In fact, the literature shows that when you're neglected, that sometimes the damage is even worse than abuse, because that happens in a relationship and in neglect. And I'm not saying they're all horrible, but that sometimes we forget about neglect as a form of very serious and insidious abuse that has lifelong consequences. And then, of course, there's the clergy abuse crisis. I wrote, the first retreat was done in 2006, and I was working on it as Rachel's Vineyard was spreading all over the world for a number of years. So it was really a desire to have a program for those who had uncovered sexual abuse, which was 65% of our participants. And I saw abortion as a traumatic reenactment. And it was also to address the spiritual abuse that I knew so many religious were suffering from. And then the clergy abuse crisis, which has impacted many children, both women and boys. And in that, the really insidious part of that is with the loss of their own innocence also frequently comes the loss of any kind of faith. And in fact, some of the questions that people that have suffered any kind of abuse want to know is, how did God let this happen? And where was he? And why didn't he stop it? So, of course, Grief to Grace is a really beautiful journey. It's a week-long program where Jesus travels alongside you as a fellow abuse survivor, because we know from the Passion that there was, a lot of humiliation. And it's debated among many theologians that it's quite possible that Jesus was also sexually abused. We know that he was stripped naked, which would have been very humiliating for a Jew, because that was a sign to strip all dignity from you and humiliate you and render you powerless. So just the very crucifixion, the scourging was physical abuse. And even our Lord cried out, my God, why have you abandoned me? So we know that he understands what abuse survivors have gone through, probably better than anyone. And just like Rachel's Vineyard, we unite our suffering to Lord as we travel the paschal mystery of our own suffering, the passion caused by sin, the grief and the mourning, and the death experience, death to our sense of self, death caused by sin, inflicted on them, and then moving into an experience of resurrection. So it's all there. And the first 2 days sort of look at the memories and sort of dig up some of the trauma, and then everything, all the disorder that is remembered is sort of ordered in the context of the Passion. And I'd love to share how that happens, because it's very creative. It's a somatic journey as well. There's many rituals to facilitate grief work. And there's many exercises where you let your body tell the story. And we work with trauma freeze poses and group sculptures and individuals, all the somatic exercise really helps us feel the trauma on another level, on a physiological level, as we have a lot of psychoeducation also, so that they can begin to slow down triggers, because this kind of trauma is fraught with triggers, especially most painfully in the ability to trust another human person when terrible things have been done to you by someone you trusted, or a complete stranger. So the world becomes topsy-turvy, and a lot of fears and patterns that originated in the trauma sort of take root as a way that people learn to protect themselves at the time of the trauma. But those patterns and even those beliefs persist, and they have to be untwisted, because they're fraught with we call them lies, but it's like where the truth is distorted, where the image of God in them through the abuse has become obscured. And so to reclaim your identity as a child of God, and to grieve the damage, and then to unite all that suffering with Jesus in his passion, and right into the tomb, we do it all. Um, this is the journey that it's a rhythm of each day. There's a rhythm in the meditations, and again, we're dipping in and out of the trauma. We don't ever tell the whole story in one sitting. We just break it into slivers of memory, and then the message that you learned about yourself in the world, and that if that message was a lie, what would be the truth? And then they trace to any behaviors that they continue in, that they use to protect themselves. And this is where we can uncover vows that have been made, like, I will never trust any person again, or like vows that keep you sort of stuck in the trauma, unable to move on into a different response. So it's very rich with experiences, and again, ending that isolation and that feeling that something's so inherently wrong with you that you can't move on, or that the trauma is constantly hijacking your life into flashbacks, nightmares, instability, and a lot of trouble self-regulating, especially when abuse of any kind happens in childhood, where a parent isn't there to protect, or a parent might be the cause of it, or you have parents who are not attentive to what's going on, or they're in their own thing. And we know that's true of most children who are groomed, that there's something going on in the family where the children don't have a lot of oversight, perhaps sometimes, not in all cases, but certainly for children who grow up in an unstable situation, or with a parent who's not present, or mentally ill themselves, or suffering their own trauma, they're not able to do that kind of teach the child to self-soothe by validating its feelings. And also, when your judgment, many abuse victims blame themselves, and they've been conditioned to blame themselves because of things the abuser said, in ways that they were threatened should they ever tell, but they carry on in this sort of traumatic survivor mode of always feeling the threat.
And Theresa, in many of these cases, and that's why if people listening right now, they might say it might begin to trigger some memories for some people, because very often, like with sexual abuse, it's sometimes within the family. Like, a father is sexually abusing his younger daughters and things, and then sometimes the mother, when she finds out, instead of protecting her children, protects the abuser, as you know. I mean, that's one scenario.
Sure.
Then you have, an uncle, maybe,
Right.
a favorite uncle who's come over, or grandfather, and they're the ones who are the abusers, and this is part of the whole family. And so doesn't that forces the victim to be silent, and to just be abused more, basically, because of the whole family dynamic. And then they get to being an adult, and they still have all that stuff behind them. I mean,
Yeah.
how do they take that first step, I guess, is what I'm trying to get to. How do they get to grief to grace with so much trauma on them? Do they make a phone call first? You have a hotline number, which we'll show on the screen for everybody. But how that must be so difficult to take that first step to say, can you help me, right?
Yeah, I would say that people hear about it. Almost all these programs have been spread a lot by word of mouth. And so someone will tell them about it who went on it. And Grief to Grace is in 25 countries now. We do very little advertising. I don't have a budget for that or anything. Everybody's a volunteer. So it's word of mouth. And a lot of people from Rachel's Vineyard heard about it from Rachel's Vineyard leaders. Oh, and I forgot to say this. Another reason that I wanted to make Grief to Grace was for our leaders, most of whom have had abortions. But there's other ones who didn't, but they knew the pain of keeping secrets and they understood trauma well from histories of sexual abuse. And I wanted more than anything to give those leaders all over the world an opportunity to heal their grief in the midst of all the ministry they're doing with others. So that was another thing that was very exciting for me, to open up for leaders who perhaps didn't have an abortion, but definitely had trauma and had similar struggles and a tremendous amount of shame that just needed to be lifted off them.
Right. Now, this is different than Rachel's Vineyard. Rachel's Vineyard is a retreat over the course of a weekend. This is a whole week, right, Theresa? So
yeah,
basically, if you're going to go off on a Grief to Grace program, you've got to kind of take vacation from your life, from your job, from whatever, to go away, right, to the retreat sites. And of course, again, confidentiality, just like with Rachel's Vineyard. But we're talking about a solid week of delving into this difficult past, right?
Yes, and it's a very thorough program. It touches on everything. People cannot believe the level of integration of psychological and spiritual that's done so seamlessly and creatively. And we really do help them rearrange their relationship with the trauma so that when they remember things, they're going to remember it in another context through the support of the group and a lot of the somatic work with their bodies, and also bringing people before the divine physician, because honestly, even the best therapist can't do what Jesus does. He really is performing miracles, and people feel that. They leave changed. And at first I thought I could do it in a weekend, but there was no way, because it's not the same experience. Everybody comes at it, and we devote a whole day to anger work, an entire day just to anger work. And we look at trauma bonds, and they do some testing for self-awareness about how that's manifesting. And we do a lot of parts work, which is work with the inner child or the wounded child. And some people, through experiences of abuse, tend to dissociate while it's happening. And then later, they might have flashbacks and nightmares, but they don't connect it to a specific memory. But a child part might remember that. And so part of the shame of being abused, as I mentioned before, people blame themselves, but they can also develop tremendous contempt for that part that endured the abuse and somehow as a child didn't stop it. They blame themselves that they didn't stop it, or that no one believed them and it was their fault, or that somehow, especially with sexual abuse, of course, our bodies are very sensitive and they're made to respond in a certain way. So when they're touched in a certain way, if someone experiences pleasure, they felt enormous shame over that. Or I must be gay because I was aroused by a man at the age of, 6, or as a young teenager. And so there's just tremendous amount of shame, and people describe it as defining moments when they just developed a deep, deep insecurity about themselves and there's something being wrong with them. So I think that being with others who get it is the best thing. They don't have to explain themselves. Everyone gets it. In the beginning, we normalize all the survivor responses and the attachment injuries. We normalize that. We help people recognize what that looks like and identify themselves if they dissociate, and tell stories just in the beginning as we're normalizing the symptoms, which can feel not only so overwhelming but so shameful, like I should be able to control this, or what's wrong with me that I can't get over this. Everyone else says, oh, get over it and move on, and I can't.
And then you mentioned, which I can imagine they must feel a lot, is why didn't God help me? Like, God there's one thing, when there's a death in the family and people say, why did God let grandma die, or things like that. But this is different, like especially I think for sexual abuse of a child, as they're getting a little bit older and the abuse is still happening and happening, they must say, "Can't God rescue me?" Like, don't they? Isn't that feeling of, "Can't? Who's going to rescue me? Not even God, right?" So, in the course of this retreat for the whole week, do they get to the point where they can verbalize that they're upset, they're angry at the abuser, they're angry maybe at other family members who didn't stop the abuse, and then they're angry at God, right?
All of the above, and themselves. Sometimes people are enormously angry at themselves. So yeah, we do. That's why we have a day for anger, because there's so many ways that it goes. And for the attachment injury, and the living scripture we use that we reenact in our own little way is Jesus getting angry at the temple, in the temple. And he was angry because the temple was being misused. And our bodies are temples. And when they've been abused, the Lord is enraged. And I think that when people really experience him, because how many times, especially as Catholics or people of faith, oh, don't let the sun fall down on your anger, and be angry but don't sin. But anger is a protective device, a protective instinct to say something's wrong here, and to seek justice. We need our anger, but we can't live with tight fists, because that's its own cancer. And I love our exercises, especially as we're I'll tell a little story about what we do, because it's really important, where they make pictures of themselves on the first night as beautiful creations of God, made in his image and in his likeness. And people lose that original image of their innocence. And some people can't even draw that because they never remember a time when they felt wanted, or maybe they knew they were unwanted, or their mother was in distress. There's other people who've been on the retreat whose mothers tried to abort them, and they knew about it. So they felt like the trauma actually began in the womb before they even made it onto the earth. But they draw pictures of themselves and other people. The instructions are draw pictures before all the abuse distorted and injured you. So it would be a happy, smiling child. And it's so sweet, because they draw these beautiful pictures, and many people feel very proud, and they would like to remember that they were actually once happy, because that's what we want to go back to, that innocence, because the shame is placed on them by the abusers. It was never theirs to carry. It's not who they are. Maybe they had to contort to it in some way to live through it. And this is where the attachment injuries come in, which I'll speak about in a second. But then we take those pictures through the whole passion. So in the agony in the garden, they remember the betrayals that they suffered, and the next day, the scourging and the crowning of thorns, the humiliations, physical scars of abuse, and they start to deface their picture with the marks and the symbols of their abuse. So you go from this original child to what some people have just made the most, they really document in a beautiful way, and sometimes a very dramatic way, the injuries that are not seen. And they're able to put them on paper and be able to nail that to the cross. Near the very end, when they unite their suffering, they say, "My God, why have you abandoned me? Into your hands I commend my spirit." And that we just recreate that scene. And there's wailing, similar to the same wailing, because we are acting as the suffering body of Christ. And I imagine that when the Lord was killed, there was similar wailing like that, because if we're all created in God's image, isn't that the goal of all abuse, is to distort it and make people feel evil? And our goodness needs to be reclaimed, because we're sons and daughters of the living God, and he wants nothing more than to bring us close to him despite what's happened. And in him and through his wounds and our wounds is this great unity that I think is the greatest blessing. And people could say later they never would have thought of their abuse as a blessing, but through the healing, through the resilience, through this relationship they have, that they may never have found were it not for their desperation, that there's just a great release of gifts and life and new life, and an end to the old patterns. So you really can heal from it. We really can heal from abuse. We've seen the miracles all the time. And I promised to go back to the attachment injury because I think it's a big piece of this, that a child will always attach to a caregiver, even if they're abusive. Research shows that they will attach because that's actually one of our greatest survivor instincts, is to attach to a parent or a caregiver. And we even see maybe a monkey in the woods, like you'll go to whoever is going to care for you, and that's a survivor instinct. But then when that caregiver is responsible for hurt and pain, there's a conflict because you have this drive to attach, and then you have a tremendous fear to attach. So it leads to submissive behaviors, and that's characterized by pleasing and appeasing. So a lot of children will become the caretakers of their parents, or their parent, or the abuser, and they learn to do that to avoid a worse threat, and complying with their needs and wishes. And then there's a collapse response. This is all like submitting, where you submit, and then you kind of collapse. And people can physically collapse when they're in that position for too long, and it leads to caretaking behaviors and depression, a lot of self-loathing because there's no agency. You're just always complying, and passive. It's the good girl, good boy, always pleasing, and you feel very helpless, hopeless, and unworthy because they're blaming themselves for not standing up, not being able to fix things. And then the attached part seeks rescue. There's a fantasy in a lot of people for rescue. Some people, even as adults, the child part will take over and they'll go hide, and they're just waiting for someone to come and find them. So when that happens, nobody gets in trouble. We just rejoice that they're found, that we were worried about them. Come back and be with our group, because there's this fantasy, and I've seen that played out many times, and I understand it that way, that the reenactments are going to happen until there's a resolution. They're going to keep putting themselves in the same position, looking for rescue or looking for love, and yet the circumstances are, they're more attracted. You can be very hyper vigilant and on the alert for threats of danger, but naive, unbelievably naive, because it's so familiar, a pattern.
Right.
That's the other
And
thing. The abuse feels normal. What's normal when you grow up like that? You don't know. And that's where the group is so helpful in validating their injury. And in the anger work, members of your own small groups can come up and defend you and speak to abuser in a way you might not be able to until they do it first, and then you're able to join them. So it's real. There's just so much support. What were you going to say? I'm sorry.
no, it's okay. And I'm just saying, you in the course of this whole week, obviously, this is very intense
It is.
trauma that you're dealing with, and there are certified counselors on Grief to
Absolutely.
Grace, right? Is it one? Is it two? I mean,
Oklahoma has 7 plus, I think we have 4 on our team.
oh yeah, that's what I'm saying. There's several counselors there because this is very, very deep rooted trauma.
Yes.
And then if someone's listening to all this and they kind of feel like, they feel there's a member of their family that something's not right. Like what are, like, with abortion, we know there's like signs to look for, right? If they're hurting from an abortion. With sexual abuse, what are the signs? And my next question was kind of into this, is that I noticed there's been such an increase with young people with cutting. Is that a behavior, this cutting, where they say, I'm taking her for counseling and she's cutting herself and suicidal and da da da? I mean, that could also be sexual abuse in their background. Is that correct?
Well, sure. The self-harm is an attempt to bring yourself back from numbness. So like dissociation, numbness, shutting down, and depersonalization are all parts of traumatic experience. So if you start to feel like you're not connected to your body, or you're in the middle of a traumatic experience and you're dissociating all the time, the cutting and the pain is actually a way to bring you back to your body. And it's a temporary relief from that very bewildering feeling of floating outside yourself, the experiences of derealization, where you feel like you're not connected, you're just there, or you're like looking at everybody around you like you're in a fog. And what's really cool is when people describe how it shows up for them, they all have really great examples. And other people are like, they never even knew that submitting or fawning, which is where you can't say no to anybody and you're always pleasing and appeasing and you're afraid of any conflict or afraid of people being mad at you, because in the past, if you got out of line or irritated an abuser, you're going to get harmed more, or even someone who's physically angry and is beating you and stuff. So you learn to live through it by adapting, and then that's where the patterns come from. And the patterns, we really go, like, triggers are there and we use them, we look at them, we don't judge them, we become curious about them, we slow them down, and then we practice another response than the knee-jerk reflex, which is what a trigger causes, into fight, flight, fear, freeze, fawn, submit, and attach. And I was talking about the submit's one way that people do. But the other symptoms of an attachment injury, which is always going to happen out of abuse, is that I talked about seeking rescue. And then there's also, you're desperate for connection. And this is where people will go from lover to lover to lover later as adults, because they feel like, I'm desperate to have somebody care about me, because it's a place of great poverty in the past. And there was a sense that nobody cared about me, so I have to find that person who's going to be there for me. They can be very sweet and needy and dependent, very childlike, and they have a great fear of abandonment, being abandoned. And there's a lot of loneliness, but they look very charming and kind of like charming or caretaking, and just like wanting to scoop up friends here and there by overdoing it for them, giving gifts all the time, things like that. So we also explore trauma bonds, and they can see where their trauma bond expresses itself in reenactments or trauma withholding of pleasure, or there's many ways that this manifests itself. But it's kind of like really good to learn where you're vulnerable, because in times of stress, that's what people go back to, those childhood ways of functioning. What you learn to do to survive is what goes immediately into gear when you're faced with a threat.
Right. And so this is a whole week program. So by the time we get to the last day of Grief to Grace, I mean, I know what happens with Rachel's video, but with Grief to Grace, like, how does this culminate at the end so that they're in a better place, they're peaceful? Some of them probably still need follow-up counseling, maybe. What happens at that last departure part?
Well, I mentioned the bringing up memories and the anger work, and the drawing of the pictures and all that. And then when we enter the passion, we go through each stage of, the passion that day, and then right into the tomb. So after the pictures are on, everybody sings "Were You There When They Crucified My Lord?" as we carry it into the tomb. And that's a chapel that's dark, all lit with candles, and it's the end of the day. And there's nothing more you can do with what happened, but the living scripture is all about what you've witnessed in the past 3 days. And you're remembering all the ministry of Jesus, because we had many living scriptures before the passion of his teaching and his healing ministry. And you're remembering all those things, and there you are, and there's nothing you can do but to wrap your pain in the burial cloth with Christ. And then they received rocks, sort of similar to Rachel's video, where they carry around the rocks, but this represents the obstacles standing between them and new life in Christ, and they put them down in the tomb. And it's just a very sacred, very reverent, lots of tears in that whole last page, that the Passion Day. The cross is a beautiful somatic exercise. Everybody picks a song, and it's their song that represents their cross and what it's been like carrying the cross of their abuse all these years. And so there's no speaking in it, and you can use other people if you want for a prop to show a marriage or this or that. But a true cross is really the agony and the ecstasy. So the ecstasy would be times where you felt God's presence and you were happy, and then what happened. So people sort of act out their life with this cross, the times that they rejected it and threw it down, and other times it might have been a crutch for them, and other times a balancing act, or how they had to hide behind it. And it's just beautiful. And like I said, we have a lot of priests and nuns who come, so there's really a language that they've not found in any other therapy for their beliefs, and this struggle with a cross, because it's an instrument of torture and it's also the symbol of our salvation. But that's the mystery of the whole thing. And they walk that mystery and they show it out, and you could hear a pin drop aside from the music, because it's so riveting, and people are totally in their bodies with this story, and that's a huge somatic release to show that. And it sounds like a difficult thing, and I remember there were some cultures, even in England, because they're like, oh, English people will never do that, but you get them to choose their own song, and boy, do they get out there the most creative ways of revealing that inner world comes out, and the drama of that inner world, because our lives are passion plays, aren't they? But when we can unite all that suffering with Christ, we are on our way, and He does the heavy lifting for preparing us for Easter Sunday, because the next day we have a living scripture where you're in the tomb and you've always hasn't been so sure, and because you're there in all the scenes, and you watch Jesus. Not that you watch him rise, but you're there for the explosion, and then the cave is filled with colors and fragments of light, and then you see Jesus and he says, "Peace be with you," and then we play Alleluia, and everyone's dancing. And before that, we do an ancient ritual of Passover, which is we start with cup of tears, which is part of that celebration. And here it's the endive, as a promise of new life. And so the exercise is rebuilding the temple, and they draw themselves as a temple. Their body, like they draw themselves as a temple, and they can put whatever jewels and artwork that they want in it, whether the doors are open or closed. And it's really themselves as a church, as a place of worship. Some people draw themselves as a tiny adoration chapel, others a majestic cathedral. Some have a beautiful little spot out in nature. And it's just another creative thing. And we talk about rebuilding the temple and what rubble needs to be moved away, and how do we clear the space. And that the whole fact is that the Lord wants to rebuild the temple, and that the glory of that temple belongs to Him. But we want to engage in the work with Him. So there's just so many beautiful symbols and activities that really not only speak to the heart, but allow an expression of a lot of repressed and bottled up emotions. So people leave feeling like there's been a very deep cleansing. And then we have another beautiful ritual where they wash themselves in a bowl, and they've had a meditation of going into the inner chamber of their own hearts. And it's very beautiful, where the Lord is making all things new. And there's, I could keep talking because it's 5 days long, but that's how we get to the other side, because we just complete the journey. And then there's all sorts of resources in the back. And we have people who've been through Grief to Grace. We're offering online somatic classes to help with parts work, and lots of aftercare opportunities. So yeah, it's a work of grace, and everybody feels so privileged to serve on a team in any capacity. Again, everyone's volunteer. I would say everyone's a survivor of something. And I think that's true. If you live long enough, you're going to be a survivor of something. But
Right.
many of them have known childhood abuse.
Right.
Even
And
our
then,
counselors.
and then finally, they complete that whole week. But then, is there an opportunity to, I don't know, have some sort of reconciliation if that abuser is still around or part of the family or in the life? I mean, is there any discussion as to, like, how do they deal with that person now? Like, if they've gone through all this healing, and maybe it's Uncle so-and-so who'll still show up at the next family gathering, whether it's a funeral or a wedding or whatever, are they in enough of a safe space to know how to deal with the abuser if they encounter them again?
Well, some people haven't even recorded an abuser, so that may be a part of their aftercare if they are going to do that. Um, I I think that basically the activities in forgiveness, when the teaching in forgiveness does not urge premature forgiveness, because that actually mimics denial and avoidance
Right.
sometimes. And people who prematurely forgive without the proper grieving, which is what we're doing all week, without tallying up the cost, how this has damaged you, all the insidious ways you weren't even aware of, that abuse has been a major theme throughout the life. And I know that a lot of people have never seen the pattern in such clarity ever until we're doing the memories work and we're slowing it down and the themes, because they deal with many memories, but they all have similar thread running through it that sort of dominates the life and then predicts the future, if I could say it that way. So, so that's kind of the awareness. And then out of that, you can move into what do you want to do? Like, I think parts work can be really helpful for people. For those with complex PTSD, they're going to have to work a little longer in rewiring their nervous system where they can,
Right.
you know, um, where they can rewire your nervous system. I want to say what that means when I say that. It's sort of like you're set in a reflex mode to respond in a certain way, and you have to be able to step back and breathe first and ground yourself. And they learn all those skills. So they leave with a bucket of skills and a formula to take away when new things arise. And then, of course, they can meet in reunions and Zoom meetings, and if there's local site. Philadelphia's kind of weird. A lot of people come here from far away, other countries, so having a local meeting isn't so. But like in Diocese of San Bernardino or Diocese of Phoenix, it's most of the people are Oklahoma City. They're local, and so their follow up is able to be do that. We do ours
But
online.
but Zoom has been a great gift, don't you
Oh
think,
yeah,
for
yeah.
the follow up and for meetings, and then also too, I think, there's kind of a benefit, I guess, to say, to even if you can never mail the letter, give the letter, but to write this "you hurt me" kind of letter to these abusers. You know what I mean? Just to, and you know what I mean, to get it out, writing it down. It's just like in the Rachel's Vineyard when you write a letter to your child. Writing a letter to the abuser. You hurt me when this happened and this happened, and then the other neglectors on stage, like the mother who ignored the abuse, or the other aunt who knew about it and did nothing. I mean, is there an aftercare component to kind of like, because I can imagine in a week like that, they start having all kinds of triggers and memories of, oh yeah, this person did this and this, they didn't help me, and I tried to ask for help and they didn't help me. I mean, so is that part of this old follow-up that they can keep
Well,
coming back or
they
asking
do a
for?
lot. They do a lot of rehearsal of what it
Uh-huh.
would feel like, a role plays rehearsal. The anger work is really significant because the letter is just a jumping point. They do write a letter, but it's really a launching point into the anger work. And then we have a merchant's table with like a whip that Jesus had in the temple. There's money you're allowed to throw, and like to have a physical expression of
Right.
reclaiming your voice and taking back your power. And with the
Right.
abuser, it's more like putting back on them what belonged to them, and keeping your reclaiming your dignity, and that it wasn't your
Right.
fault, and um, that some people go really like there's so much in them that comes out, and it's a major detox, and they feel wonderful when it's over. And like, we don't do anger work on the military retreat, for example, because if people have had problems with anger, then they would be, I mean, in the military retreat, we're trying to calm and soothe, not rev up what has already been conditioned to be revved in times
Right.
of threat, right? But for people who've never spoken their truth, this is a day of reckoning where they speak their truth to any abusers. And then for people that have pain syndromes, or we don't want them hurting their arm, because when you're mad, you have like
Right.
so much adrenaline. It's like a natural painkiller. So there's a quieter, gentler group for them that would be more somatic work, but they're going to be expressing and releasing it. What they decide to do in real life after all the rehearsal, but for some people, just to get over the terror of verbalizing to someone that they've never confronted, you know,
Right.
or if they decide to write a letter. But that's things that they're going to work out if they need to. Other people just feel so free. They don't want to waste another second of their life. Um, but pursuing the justice for themselves means
Right.
getting rid of their rage because that's only hurting them. It's danger for them,
Right.
and it can be really difficult for the
Yeah.
people around them because you end up scapegoating the people you most love.
So now, just as wrapping up here, because this is such a difficult topic, um, there's the website's been scrolling on the bottom there about the Living Scriptures, institute.org. Lots of information is there. The hotline number, of course, was scrolling throughout. And then, just in final wrap up for parents who are trying to help their kids not get into these situations, I always say there must be like a little to-do list of do this, don't do this. Like, I know I could just speak as a grandma, and I know my daughters with their kids, they don't let them go on these sleepovers to someone else's home, if because they say, well, we don't know that family. I remember hearing my one daughter one day disappointing my granddaughter saying, no, you can go, but you can't, no sleeping over. We'll pick you up at 10:30. You'll come home then. And so, well, we don't even know that family that well. So like, sometimes there are things we can do to minimize the chances, right, of a child being exposed to situations, right? Isn't there like a little to-do list of do's and don'ts kind of thing, right? And
Oh yeah.
especially now because of social media, these kids are on their phones and they can be lured, right, into situations. So, come on, as a therapist here now, can you give a little parental advice about this is like some guidance for parents? Like,
Well, I think that we totally underestimate the amount of not only sex trafficking and all of that, but abusers and in every community. It is endemic. And the whole internet was actually developed by the porn industry, knowing that they would have access to every home and every child in America in the chat rooms. So there are some really real dangers out there. There's many websites, and I should have a name of them here. I wasn't prepared, but I know that there's many things. I've taught classes on this of what you can do to prevent that. But it's very hard in a culture where every child is demanding a cell phone and they want, but if you don't have screeners and blockers on your thing and can go in to look at your kids' social media, I know of many people from really good families who've been sucked into that and ended up having been photographed and everything else in chat rooms. And I'm talking little girls, little boys, 6 years old, 5 years old, where they get on and then the threats begin and they get scared. They don't know who to talk to. So always having the conversations at the table about not just the dangers of it, but never be afraid to come to me. I will believe you. And then to do the controls, because this is not controlled. And as much as there's police out there investigating things, this is rampant everywhere. And the numbers being made on porn and all these sexual
right.
things are so astronomical. I don't think that anyone would feel safe. And we can't be cautious enough because it can result in a lifetime of trauma. And I'd much rather see a parent prevent it by being the bad
Vigilant.
guy. We
Right.
don't have to be our kid's best friend, and they might hate us that they can't go to the sleepover. I remember doing that with my girls. I'm like, sorry, we're not taking that chance. And people used to tell me, even too much, or it's because of your work that you're so overprotective. And I'm like, no, my children are way too precious to me. And I was criticized by people, but every single parish I ever belonged to, which was like six, every single one of them had a pastor removed. And I was so glad because I had got criticized by friends that I wouldn't let them be altar boys or whatever, because even when they look wonderful and good, we don't know. And there was so much of that going on, especially when I was raising my kids. And now it's a whole internet thing, and every profession is touched by this. But
Right.
I feel like
Yeah, and so just to sum up for parents,
Yeah.
Get those cell phones and put all the controls, the lockdowns and devices. They're out there. You can do it. You should. There's also something else I know my daughters do it for my grandkids. It's called, I think, 360, that you always know where your kid is.
Right.
It shows you where they are. And I think that's fabulous because, you know, the phone doesn't lie where they are. You know, they can't lie to you that they're here and they're not there. Those are all important things. And stop so much screen time. Don't let them have their phones in the bedroom at night by themselves, you know, to help them sleep at night, or the phone to wake them up in the morning. Because that's, wouldn't you say, Theresa, those are all the danger zones when they're alone with the phone, correct?
Well, there should be no privacy allowed with a cell phone or a, you know,
iPad, all the devices.
Because there's just too much out there that's a threat. Even their own conversation with peers and the sexting pictures, you know, devastating for people, and it results in suicide. The consequences are too high to take the risk.
Exactly. Well, Dr. Burke, this has been an exhausting conversation, I have to say. But I hope.
Deep breath, Janet. Everybody, deep breath with me.
But I hope this has helped so many people to understand there's no, if you're hurting, there's nothing wrong with you. There's help. You've got this beautiful program, Grief to Grace, livingscriptureinstitute.org. All the info is there. They have the hotline. We've been scrolling that all throughout this program. You're not alone. You're going to feel so much better. Reach out. Talk to someone from Theresa's team. They're here for you. And Grief to Grace is just exploding all over the world because, unfortunately, we live in a world where there's so much abuse, and we can heal it. Jesus is the healer. So, Dr. Burke, what can I say but thank you for your gifts, and it's awesome what you do. So thank you, and God bless.
Oh, thanks, Janet.
Well, brothers and sisters, like I said, this was a difficult show, a difficult topic, but an important one. I hope you learned a lot today, and thanks for joining us. And remember, reach out to that website because help is available.